the speakers. So my name is Darya Tsymbalyuk. I'm a PhD student at the School of Modern Languages and International Relations, and my PhD focuses on stories of displacement from Donbass, and particularly human-plant relations, and also kind of look at coal and mining history of the region, since Donbass is a huge mining and metal region in Ukraine through the vegetal land. So looking at coal as a kind of non-human archive. And today we'll be speaking to Leyla Sayfutdinova and Matilde Morales. Leyla Sayfutdinova is a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Social Anthropology and the Center for Energy Ethics. Her research project, Turning Oil into Stone, Oil Legacies in the Narratives of Urban Continuity and Change in Baku, Azerbaijan, examines some of the ways in which oil has shaped urban space and memory in Baku, one of the earliest oil cities in the world. Leyla has an interdisciplinary background, including conflict studies, BA from St. Petersburg State University, and sociology, PhD from Middle East Technical University, Turkey. And her research has always focused on the post-socialist transition in Azerbaijan, including urban change, nationalism, and the impact of post-Soviet industrial restructuring on engineers. Matilde Morales is a postgraduate student at the School of Modern Languages. She's completing the joint master's cross-Western cultural narratives at the University of St. Andrews and the University of Adam Mickiewicz, Poznan, and has a BA in comparative literature and society from Columbia University. Matilde is interested in energy, the environment, and the arts of the left in Eastern Europe and Latin America. Her current project looks at literal and visual representations of oil in two moments of political transition in Russian history, the early Soviet period and the beginnings of Putin's presidency. So I'm really super excited to be talking to both of you today, and actually coincidentally, today is 60 years since Yuri Gagarin went to space. We didn't plan it this way, but it's quite interesting to think about this event and how it redefined kind of our visions of what it means to be human, of the relations between human in industry, science and industry, and Soviet modernity. And Yuri Gagarin was actually then the first person who saw the Earth at the kind of whole totality from space, which is pretty cool. And then later, when the images were circulated, mostly done by the American Apollo missions, this ideas of the Earth as one system, as one ecosystem, as a whole totality, really triggered a lot of discussions in ecology and about environment, and kind of thinking of humans as one species, as a kind of one whole as well. And I think this will all feature today in our discussions, but also just thinking, of our role in this world and the kind of extractivist ideologies that governed the Soviet world and governed a lot of post-Soviet countries. And to start with, we're talking about energy humanities, which is a subfield of environmental humanities, which developed very closely to natural sciences. Particularly also discussions, of course, around the Anthropocene, which are happening in geology. My research is centered around critical plant studies, which has scholars from botany and scholars from humanities and social science. So it's very interdisciplinary. I myself read quite a lot of research in paleobotany, in particular Soviet paleobotany. So I'm quite interested what's the relation of your research to natural sciences, and also just thinking of the way humanities are kind of trying to position itself within this kind of broader conversation, and addressing the problems of industrialization and fossil fuel extraction and climate change. What are your thoughts on this? And whoever would like to start first, if Leyla, would you like to start?
Well, yeah, except that I'm not from humanities.
That's true.
I'm actually an interdisciplinary social scientist, and my most significant training is from sociology. And having kind of conversed with some people from humanities on issues of energy in recent months, I think it's actually very interesting how we have different approaches to similar questions. I mean, I will not speak about the humanities approaches because I think Matilde and you, Darya, can do that much better than myself. But as a social scientist, I'm always interested about the kind of people's dimension, both in terms of individual and like the impact of, let's say, industrialization and industrial restructuring, oil industry on individuals and on various collectivities. So my PhD research, for example, focused on a professional group of engineers and how this post-Soviet transition affected their work and their life. So speaking about the connection to natural sciences, because I worked with engineers, I mean, I kind of had to be exposed a little bit to, some geology and geological concepts when they were trying to explain to me the work that they were doing in the oil fields and stuff like that. But to me, most interesting was not this kind of natural scientific part per se, but it was more interesting how it impacted their vision of the world and what is civilization and what is their own place in that civilization. And one thing that was very apparent in my research, for example, was that for engineers, technological development was really a proxy for development. So like developed for them means that it was actually using complex technology, and everything else was somewhat subordinated to that kind of grand vision. And so that really affected a lot of their views. I mean, even in economics or even in political views. So, for example, although they regretted, some of them regretted some aspects of the Soviet social protection system and so on and so forth, they kind of really admired the Western capitalist technological advances, and they were happy to be exposed to them and to be able to use that technology. But at the same time, they regretted that in this new order, they were relegated more to consumers of technology rather than developers of it.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Thank you, Leyla. So many, we'll definitely come back to some of these points of transition, but also this idea of progress and the idea of then, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the kind of Soviet Union modernity and how that fits into quite often the post-Soviet space is kind of stuck in the catching up rhetoric, and whether Azerbaijan is dealing with it a bit differently. So I would like to come back to that definitely, but maybe we'll give a chance to Matilde to reply to that as a humanities scholar.
Well, yeah, if we're just thinking about the natural sciences question, I think for my work, because I'm working mostly with oil, it's obviously kind of geology. That's the main science there. And well, they started like geologists when they coined like the term Anthropocene or proposed it. It like started, I think, a lot of research in environmental humanities. And geology is also very important in the Soviet Union when, like, in these processes of kind of like exploration for like trying to find new natural resources in Siberia, especially like new oil fields or just like gold or all these different things. So I'm not actually like working that closely with geological sources like at the moment in my research, but I think sort of like the ideas that are coming from there are really central. And I think that when I try to think about the sort of humanistic intervention that the environmental humanities are trying to make into these more scientific fields, I think it has to do with this moment of kind of like transition that we're at, and of like the need to imagine a future that is going to be like post oil or post fossil fuels, post like everything that we know. So it seems like it's a moment where like imagination is very powerful. And I think that's what sort of like given the humanities like more space to participate in these conversations than they had before.
That's true. That's definitely true, and something actually I would like to ask you next. I'm also thinking of the way the reversed way the kind of natural sciences impact the way we think. Definitely in my work is the kind of idea of the human not as a separate entity, but already kind of a multi-species entity in itself with the microbiome. And because I'm writing about plants as almost kind of extensions of the self, not necessarily a separate subject always, but almost that, that are making our realities and our worlds, and the kind of the very close entanglements through which are made as what we think are humans. I think definitely central to my work. But talking about the futures, which is something in a way both of you brought up, And I know that you both work on kind of transitions in different ways. With Matilde, you're working on transitions in the Soviet Union, but also in the current under Putin in Russia. And Leyla, you're looking at kind of oil as the constanta within the identity of Baku as a city through different regimes. And also coming back in a way to Gagarin, it's quite interesting actually. My grandma was present when he landed and gave an address at the Red Square. And I remember her talking about it, and it was a very kind of time of optimism, and believe in progress and science. And thinking as well, when you thinking about Earth as the ecosystem, I always go back to Vernadsky, who I think is such a central figure to all natural sciences in the Soviet, post-Soviet areas, who also was kind of in many ways, he's a lot of ideas from the Anthropocene we're talking about already exist in his work, but from a much more positive angle, kind of in the belief that humanity can grow to the level of technology and embrace its role and this progress. And what Leyla, you said about engineers, believing in progress in development of technology, and at the same time, the kind of narratives of Anthropocene, which are very closely tied to anxiety, to the apocalyptic imaginary, to the post-oil futures and kind of collapse. How does those two kind of reconcile, maybe in the case of your work, Leyla, or in general, what are these post-oil futures and these moments of transition? And how do the artists, writers, engineers, people who work in tourist industry in Baku, how do they engage with these questions?
Yeah, that is actually a very interesting question about post-oil. Like the short answer is I don't know. That's why I'm making this research. The slightly longer answer is that I think it's going to be quite difficult because these ideas about that oil is basically like Azerbaijan's wealth is so much ingrained that people have very hard time imagining that there will be time when this will not happen. And just last week, I was discussing with some students a film about oil in Baku and the kind of a documentary. I think you both watched it as well, this Oil Rocks Above the Sea. And there is in the end, the narrator, for example, he says that, Azerbaijani government has to make a decision about what to do with this infrastructure fast because oil is going to run out in 20 years. Well, instead of, deciding that Azerbaijan is actually drilling more wells around oil rocks right now. And, and it's real, in my interviews with engineers, for example, they really cannot see Azerbaijan without oil. And while in a lot of places this happened, that oil did kind of dry up and run out and everything, and these expectations were always present in Azerbaijan as well from 19th century, but they always there was always more oil found. And so the last one was, for example, in the 80s when the onshore was pretty much depleted and the only offshore was producing some oil. And the geologists knew that there is more oil in the Caspian Sea, but the Soviet Union didn't have the technology and did not want to invest in the technology for offshore production. And this was actually a cause for huge discontent among Azerbaijani engineers and oil industry professionals. And once it became possible to get that technology and reach that oil, so yeah, it continued. And it seemed as if this is never going to happen. So there will be ups and downs, but nobody really imagines the world when Azerbaijani oil is no longer needed. By having said that, because there are this, oil busts, booms and oil busts. So economically, it's important to have alternative sources of income. And in Azerbaijan, it seems that one way for economy to kind of reorient itself is also, I think, quite extractive. It's been real estate, investment in real estate and large infrastructural projects. And it looks like this is something in the city of Baku. This is something that's going to continue for some time. And actually it's going to expand to other parts of the country, especially now with the regaining of the territories around in Karabakh and surrounding regions. So that will require a lot of infrastructural investment. And one other thing in which Azerbaijani government is investing heavily is transportation networks, and including ports and railroads and yeah, and actually trying to see it as a inserted into this connections between Europe and Asia and eventually China. But like returning to my first question, like this is all seen as kind of secondary to oil rather than something that can replace it completely.
Yeah, Leyla, talking about transportation, you had maybe I can share it in a PowerPoint. Made me think of the PowerPoint, the painting you had, which has both. Does it have oil pipes? You said, and maybe I can share it. This one, right?
This is one of my favorite, and it's by Tahir Salahov, a famous Azerbaijani Azerbaijani Soviet artist who started actually with this industrial paintings, and it's called The Morning Train, and it's actually very accurate. So it's like in the morning, and the train is going basically to the west, and then it will turn north, and it leaves Baku and it's going north to Russia eventually. And the truck with pipes is actually bringing the pipes to Baku, and I think it's an excellent image of how the Soviet oil industry in Baku worked.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah. Trying to. Did I stop sharing? No, I didn't.
Not yet, but maybe I'll start talking while you do that.
Okay.
Yeah, because I think some of the things that Leyla was saying about how kind of like the reaction to know that oil is going to be depleted is to like very quickly extract as much as possible. Is like very similar to kind of like the projects that the Russian government has right now. Instead of like thinking about, you know, like, and this isn't unique to Russia or to the region, but instead of thinking of like how can we like divest from fossil fuels, it's just like how can we find more things. Like Russia right now is like it has invested a lot of money into extraction in the Arctic region, which is like a very kind of like a environmental disaster in the making. But the hope is that even if like the existing oil fields at some point run dry, like there's still going to be like new oil to get. And I think this kind of like difficulties of imagining like the post-oil future also, I see it too in some of the artists that I work on and writers. Like there's this idea that I find in a lot of works that I find kind of funny of like relating the fact that oils or fossil fuels are kind of like human remains, and then imagining that like in the future we'll still have oil because like there's all these humans like us who are going to be dead. And it's like this kind of like bleak like conception of the future where it's just like, well, maybe actually oil is going to outlive us all and not the opposite way.
I am oil. I'm future oil. This is super interesting. This also, when you were talking about the kind of pipes, immediately made me think to the film I was teaching last year, and Matilde, you kindly came and presented for the class as well, is by Vitaly Mansky, The Pipeline, the kind of the pipe that runs invisible and transports us west all the way across Russia and Ukraine, Belarus to Germany, and the kind of the invisibility of flows of oil, but also gas. And money. And before we talked, Matilde, you mentioned the Nobel family who had investment and made lots of wealth in Baku, but the kind of interconnectedness of extractivist ideologies and oil and gas and coal and culture, and obviously lots of the people who profit from these ideologies sponsoring a lot of cultural events. And I know that Matilde, you work very closely with visual materials, but also literature. Is there something you could comment on, the how that feeds into each other, how the critique of it and sponsored by the actual extractivist processes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there would be a lot to say. Like, first of all, there's like kind of like this, the figure of like the oil baron or like the oligarchs have been sort of like very interesting for writers in like contemporary Russia, but also before. Like, the oil baron was like kind of like a classic enemy of like Soviet writers writing about oil. But I'm also interested in how these material financial connections like happen like in the real world, so to speak, like instead of fiction. There's like a surprising amount of works that seem to be kind of like critical of oil on the surface that end up being like bought by oligarchs to decorate their houses. Or I mean, for example, last semester I was doing research on kind of like post-war Italy, and there's this movie called The Mattei Affair, which is about the former head of Eni, the Italian national like oil company, who, I mean, the conspiracy theory said he kind of like was killed by like his successors and the CIA and like all this stuff. But this movie, when I was watching it, the first slide is like, oh, this has been restored by Eni. So even though this movie is like very, very critical of what they were doing, this like oil company has some sort of like investment on some mythology, and they wanted to pay to restore the movie and kind of like keep it out there. So yeah, it's interesting, and I think it makes me. I mean, and we can say the same thing about maybe like academia, how like literary canons or like artistic canons are formed. Like the Nobel Prize is a good example of that. But also a lot of like fellowships have these names of like people who were like made their wealth through oil, like Carlos de Gulbenkian, I think is his name, is like a Portuguese oil baron of the 20th century, and like there's a lot of money now that bear his names, and it's like funding humanities research, some of which is probably like very critical of what he was doing. So yeah, it's just like interesting to like recognize that and think about how we, even if we think that we're sort of like maybe like above these like extractivist systems, like what we do is also possible because of them, and like we need to think about our own like presence and role in that whole system.
Definitely. I mean, there are discussions as well whether the whole modernity is possible because of extractivism, because of slavery, and in a way the fact that we are doing humanities or social sciences is all because of diversification of labor, and that we're definitely complicit in this whole process as well in many ways. I'm interested as well, Leyla, because you're working in relation to what Matilde was talking, because you're working also in the space of the city, which is the manifestation of oil in stone. How does that overlap then in terms of culture and space and oil?
Listening to Matilde, it was actually very interesting, because I think it's like focusing on Baku. I think this philanthropy has been a part of oil industry from the very beginning, from the first oil boom in 19th century. So I mean, I basically see this as a kind of a same, or at least similar process and mechanism that is going at work. So that is working on global scale as it was working then in 19th. So I mean, in Azerbaijan at least, schools, hospitals, public buildings, lots of public buildings were constructed by these oil barons with the money that was extracted from oil. So what do we do with this heritage? How we deal with it is, I think this is a question that is going to be answered very differently by different people in different places. So in Azerbaijan, it's now largely celebrated, and the oil barons who made those, who made those investments and created those schools and hospitals and beautiful buildings are celebrated as contributors to the development of the nation, and the kind of the exploitative nature of this oil industry, something that is not being really emphasized very strongly. And this is very different from the Soviet period, of course, where the labor was celebrated, and that kind of philanthropy was kind of not seen as important. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Actually, Leyla, you're bringing me to the next question, and I'll ask a couple of more, but I wanted just to remind everybody, I think that the structure is that for half of the time we talk and then we open the floor to questions. So if anybody has questions, please type them in the chat, or if you would like to ask in person, when we open the floor, raise your hand, but you will be recorded if you're willing to go on video and be present. But thinking of the representations of labor and workers in the Soviet Union brings me back to Soviet modernity, and something that I struggle with in my own research and engaging closely, kind of looking at the concept of the Anthropocene and critiquing it, and obviously lots of the discussion around the Anthropocene, it's very Western centered. It's all based around the discussion around capitalism, capitalism as a kind of global notion. But then I always wonder how to kind of fit in Donbass, the region I'm working on, into that, which was formed. Donbass is colonized in the Russian Empire, but then it really became the exemplary kind of mining and metallurgic region during the Soviet Union. And Stakhanov comes from Donbass, the kind of the poster child of the 5-year plans. And really, there's been lots of also critique towards the term of Donbass itself, which is a geological term, it's a Donetsk coal basin. But the idea of this region, industrial region, is, as we know, it really is kind of formed during the Soviet times, and now facing this deindustrialization, but also the conflict. I'm really kind of struggling to how to fit in the processes in Donbass to the kind of conversation on the Anthropocene and capitalism, and how that overlaps, how it's different, how it's similar. What are the points of intersection? So maybe if you could comment a bit on that, how's the Soviet modernity featuring in your research? I don't know if Matilde, would you like to go first? Or?
Well, yeah, it's definitely like the question of modernity is kind of tricky, and it's something that I see a lot too. The way you're talking about the Anthropocene is kind of like anchored in this ideas about like capitalism and how capitalism has like destroyed the planet. It's the same in a lot of this like scholarship that like brands itself as energy humanities. Like they really like to coin like new terms. So it's like petromodernity and like petrocapitalism. But I think that is something that I noticed like early on. Instead of, in reality, like a lot of the things that they call kind of like metrocapitalism were also happening in some way in the Soviet Union. Like there wasn't as much this idea that maybe like extracting natural resources in itself was like something that we shouldn't be doing, and this kind of like emphasis on profit and how profit was going to make like utopia possible, and ignoring limits because of that, I think was also part of the like Soviet approach to oil. I should also say that the sources that I've been working with are mostly from like the 1920s. So it's a moment where like maybe like Soviet modernity was still very much like in progress. I mean, maybe it was in progress the whole period of the Soviet Union, but I think I'm working with more like how people at the time were like trying to envision themselves as like a like developed society. Like in modernity was something that was like kind of like in the future still, and not something that they were like embodying, if that makes sense.
Interesting. I mean, because the Anthropocene narratives say a lot in the future as well. No, it's kind of looking at a much gloomier future, obviously, but it's always kind of looking to this, the end of the world that is coming, which is something I personally struggle with as well, as a kind of just like one end of the world for all, and kind of ignoring genocides and colonialism and other ends of the world that happen everywhere else. And obviously, coming from Ukraine is quite interesting for me always, the Chernobyl explosion and how that kind of marked the end of the world in many ways, and kind of became also as a prototype for a lot of kind of Anthropocene apocalyptic models, both in terms of research. It's studied as a kind of what's going to happen when humans leave and what's going to happen to ecosystems, but also the kind of the technoscientific catastrophe that's already happened. So in many ways, sometimes I think Ukraine is a post-Anthropocene society. That regard, I don't know, it's just to kind of provoke a bit there. Leyla, would you like to?
Yeah. Actually, my kind of thinking about Soviet modernity is, I think, slightly less abstract, and I'm just kind of recently have begun to try to think about Anthropocene and how it fits in to this. But when I think about Soviet and other modernities, I think that industrialism is probably the one thing that connects the two, although there were, of course, differences in how industries were organized. And I think it's very interesting, like with oil industry in particular, because I think oil in Soviet Union had a it had a kind of a dual role, so domestically and externally. So domestically, it was part of heavy industry, so it was part of this like prioritized sector of the economy. It was necessary. It was, I mean, eventually it was about chemical industry and development of the fuel for the space project, which is of course the highest, the biggest, the most important project of Soviet modernity. And like, so there was all this labor, there was this whole romanticization and heroization of labor and hard work and all that. But externally, and actually Soviet Union sold and exported quite a large part of its oil production. It was actually still used for in the same capitalist way. So it was extracted and sold to other countries for income. And like this dual role of oil was actually something that allowed to, at least for Azerbaijan in this post-Soviet transition, it was a connection to this non-Soviet modernity. In a different way. So now it's like without labor, without all this importance of the heavy industry and so on. It's through consumption. It's through this luxury project and this like very spectacular modernity. But it's oil that was part of the Soviet modernity in Azerbaijan, and that is like the basis of the post-Soviet modernity in Azerbaijan as well.
Can I actually on that? Can I jump in back on the presentation, because I remember the very nice Soviet visuals, but also when you said about spectacular economy and thinking of oil as commodity, I think maybe one of the images by Matilde speaks to that, if I'm not wrong. But yeah, Matilde, would you like to say something about this?
Well, yeah, just this is like a poster from like 1969, and I mean. It has the slogan is like what I was talking about before. It's like, you know, like the riches of the like below the undersoil, whatever the term is in English, are going to be kind of like the glory of the people. And yeah, it's like this, and it's this image of like a heavy, very like industrial environment where like the worker is kind of like this hero that is going to help bring oil to like, yeah, turn it into like profit for like the dreams of progress to become possible.
And maybe I'll jump to this one by Leyla.
Yeah, this one is about the same oil rock, this first oil offshore oil facility, and it's the repairmen who are going to the oil rocks. It was a series of bridges that connected to the land, but sometimes. But different platforms still had to be connected by boat. People had to go by boat. Yeah, and I mean, I think it's very, so it's kind of this socialist realism, but with this post-Stalinist twist. I think it's called severe style. So it's not necessarily very optimistic and celebratory view of hard work, but I mean, it's obvious that these people are going on a very, very difficult task, and you know they're already pretty tired, and it's going to be tough. Yeah, but I mean, so it's more realistic than socialist in that sense.
It's going to be tough. Sounds like our future. Without oil, it's going to be tough. I want to have like a million questions, but because we are here and I'm conscious of the time, I'll just ask my last one. Because
can you just show that spectacular the flame towers? No, the flame towers. Yeah, so this is, I think, the symbol of post-Soviet oil in Baku, and it's flame because it's the flame from the natural gas, but it also connects to the old symbols of Baku, which also has this three flames in it.
This one,
yeah,
as well,
yeah, this one. Yeah.
Medieval fire temple. Yeah, when you were talking, both of you were talking about these images. I mean, obviously, it's this man, very masculine representations, which always interest me. And there is a term, petromasculinity, right, by Kara Daggett, if I'm not wrong, which she links the fossil fuel extraction and the white patriarchy. But I'll stop presenting here. But would like to ask you with the gender, figures in your work and with different people of different genders are able to, I can't pronounce it, to imagine the futures differently or not. Leyla, maybe we could start with you.
Yeah, well, I am not yet sure what role gender is going to play in this research. I think I will look at how differently women participate in creation of this oil-related spaces and memorialization of oil, and of course how they're represented. But in my previous research on engineers, gender was not very central, but it was definitely something of interest to me. And I think about a third of the engineers I interviewed were women. And most of them, however, were from chemical industry rather than from oil extraction. And one of them put it in this way. She said, well, in our time, the girls went to the chemical department and the boys went to the oil field department. That wasn't 100% true, but often there was some truth to that.
Mm.
To that too. Well, I mean, like it's I don't think there was a kind of a single process in the Soviet Union in terms of women in oil industry. I think there were multiple ones, multiple processes going on at the same time. One thing I noticed is, so the oldest of my engineers were people who were educated in like 60s, and they told me about their like plant directors and senior engineers with whom they worked when they were young, who were women. In their generation, this was almost not happening anymore. In the kind of younger generation, and especially in the kind of transition generation, what happened is that a lot of engineers who were out of work or something like that in this difficult transition period, they often went into business to try to make money. And women stayed particularly in like oil-related research institutes. So research engineers, women, retained their jobs and actually continued their careers. So that kind of happened. And in the when the foreign investment came, and engineering again became, especially petroleum engineering again became a popular profession, girls started to go there as well, and especially because work in the foreign operated oil fields is like physically easier. So there are actually more women now in like foreign operated oil fields than in the state-operated ones, because it's technically easier to do.
Wait, so
yes, it's interesting. It's not a like unidirectional process.
So is it so when the interviewers who were like studying in the 60s, is it because of the post-war generation that more women were then? The women who were seniors then, is it a result of?
I think so. So I think it's a combination of like educational policies of 1930s, which really tried to attract women into the workforce and into the industry, and then the war when they stayed to work in the industry. Yeah, but then that effect kind of disappeared. Yeah.
So almost like the two waves of kind of women remain, but then they're displaced again by men. So it's kind of almost dynamic happening. Very, very interesting. Matilde, and I know that you're looking at feminization of oil as neft. Is it the time to share that image that I think you're looking at?
Yeah, there's like a few images in the slideshow that I think we could talk about. I'm also wondering if we should turn soon to the questions in the chat. But
yes, okay. This is the last one.
Yeah, well, so when we're thinking about kind of like gender and oil,
this is wonderful.
I think one big thing is that usually kind of like the process of like production and all of that is like visualized as masculine, be it like the kind of like oil barons or like the oil workers. But then consumption is usually like feminine, or also oil itself can be kind of feminine. Like I've showed this image before, but it just like makes like oil into this kind of like oriental like female figure that's like desperate to come out and to be kind of like grabbed by the sleeping a soldier. And I'm not sure if I can move the slides myself. No, I don't think I can. But so the one before this,
yeah.
It shows, yeah, so it's like this like women like in their like kind of like domestic sphere as the like people who are consuming oil. I mean, this cartoon is kind of silly, right? Because it's like the bad like toxic gas coming like from the US like through the war, and then like the good Soviet natural gas coming into the woman's kitchen. But it's actually like one of these two are like I think one of the few examples of like women represented in these like visuals of oil or fossil fuels. Yeah. I mean, that being said, I think sometimes like this idea of like maybe like oil extraction being like a inherently masculine activity or just like petromasculinity, like maybe like I don't think actually that there's like maybe like such a different sensibility that women and men have towards like oil and like modernity and like all these things that were made possible. But I think that what I'm more interested in is how oil is thought of as being this commodity in the same way that kind of like beautiful women become a commodity and in some like oil extracting countries.
Fascinating. Thank you. I'll move to the questions, right? There are two questions at least. So the first one from Victoria, I'll stop presenting. The first one is from Victoria. Victoria, would you like to ask? Shall I just read?
I can ask it if you want.
Yeah.
So I've written it up there. But I'm just interested in hearing a bit more about. Obviously, it's appropriate to be anxious about the current climate situation. I don't mean to suggest that we should be moving on so quickly to immediately become kind of constructive and optimistic again in the way that those people gathered on the square watching Yuri Gagarin's great achievement should be. But it's also evident, and I think you've kind of come to this a couple of times in the conversation, that like the kind of pervasive pessimism and the post-apocalyptic sort of the obsession with post-apocalyptic aesthetics can sometimes be kind of unconstructive in the way that they're kind of paralyzing and prevent. I don't know. Also, and this is something kind of I'm grappling with right now. Also, the kind of the Anthropocene imaginary, which kind of decenters the human, and as a consequence, kind of allows like sort of disappears the human, and then perhaps potentially, leaves a big question mark as to what like the human's role should be. Is it again kind of reconstructing these anthropocentric processes if we're then to say, well, there is a role for humanity in kind of trying to fix this? Are those kind of fixing narratives really instrumentalizing and kind of recentering in a way that's not constructive? So I feel like there's a kind of a paralyzing sort of tendency in some of the discussion that goes around the Anthropocene, and I'm just wondering, from your points of view, how do you see your work contributing to these processes? Do you think it's appropriate that we're just now sort of in this process of reckoning and kind of premature mourning for a lot of sort of paralyzing narrative, and maybe humans have done enough, so now it's time for them to be paralyzed? Or do you think that there still is something sort of constructive that research can do and can contribute to the debates that are ongoing about climate crisis? Yeah, I would be really interested in hearing your thoughts about that.
Anybody would like to go first?
Well, I can try, but I don't know. I'm actually thinking, as a social scientist, I do tend to be concerned more about, individuals and human collectivities, and how we and they will deal with this, rather than like seeing, rather than decentering human. So I mean, I'm not quite yet in that Anthropocene way of thinking where humans are decentered. But one thing that strikes me is that I think there is a disjuncture between those visions of collapse and that the world, the climate change is going to just kill the world and so on, and the somehow I don't think everyone across the world shares this vision. So definitely I think in Azerbaijan, people, even when they are affected by climate change, such as droughts, such as, for example, it's for second or third year now that the main river, Kura, it basically dries. It doesn't bring any water into the Caspian as it's supposed to do. And it's been happening for several years now. So it's a very, practical, this affects agriculture, this affects lives of, huge number of people in Azerbaijan. But, still this, there is not yet this connection that, this is because of, this global oil consumption. So I think that the drive is still more to reach the level of Western consumption rather than to limit it and to change something here. And the kind of the responsibility is not seen as lying with Azerbaijani people or Azerbaijani state, but if it is somewhere, it's really not here. So I mean, I think for me, working on that context and on that setting, I think I'm more interested about connecting those two. And actually, I think those optimistic scenarios, which you, Victoria, say that they are not possible anymore. I think in Azerbaijan, they are still possible. So my mother, for whom the figure of Gagarin is still very important. She's a natural scientist. When my son was born, and she was thinking about who he will become, one of the first thing in her mind was that he will be cosmonaut. And I was like, what cosmonaut? Why cosmonaut? But I mean, this is actually, this is not gone yet in some parts of the world. So I think for me, it's more interesting to connect these two visions right now. So I'm not yet thinking about, synthesizing something new out of them.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure if Victoria wanted to add something else, but if not, I can try to. I mean, I think it's a very kind of difficult thing to answer, because even the maybe disciplines that we think as being better suited to fix climate change are not really fixing climate change either. The natural sciences and technology. But I think if I'm trying to think of what I hope humanities could do is this idea that there's kind of alternatives to how humans lived and have lived that are not going to destroy the planet, and that we need to kind of recover those, either because they're kind of coming from maybe marginal communities that are not considered the norm of the human, or because they're just sort of ideas of modernity that never really came to fruition because of many different factors that we can even quantify. So yeah, I think it's if humanities has an important role to play in this climate change situation, it's more, I think, about trying to rethink what it means to be human and to act human in the world. And I think that there is some research that tries to do this in an optimistic way. Sometimes it seems a bit kind of naive, perhaps, but it exists. So I think if we want to kind of read feel good, environmental humanities work, there is some to be found.
Yeah. Can I add something? I lost all my thought listening to it, but I do think there's also the kind of, I think humanities can work harder. And humanities has human in a sense, right? And comes from the idea of human, but to work harder on kind of trying to stay away from universalizing, which is something obviously university stands for as well, with the kind of universal, and to really work harder to address many different narratives. I really struggle to think about these questions practically within the context of Ukraine, because Ukraine still draws heavily on, for example, coal, right, in terms of its energy, but then at the same time, that is kind of political independence from Russia, and we don't, the gas question is there. So in a way, if you don't have that, then we have to negotiate the other thing, or and I'm not an expert in this, but sometimes so many things overlap when you come to very particular kind of solving things on the ground, which I'm not really good at, and that's why I don't do it. But also thinking in a way, whenever we talk about Ukraine and the kind of once again the discussion around climate change and the Anthropocene, obviously led mostly by the Western countries, and the idea of climate trauma, which is probably one of the most interesting research in cultural memory to me, is kind of centered around climate trauma and the kind of mourning and trauma of the event to come rather than mourning something in the past. But there is a lot of critique that it mostly comes from the societies that once again didn't experience, or communities that didn't experience kind of genocides or colonialism or other gruesome things. And thinking about Donbass once again, you wonder, and in the space of Ukraine, there is a war going on. The apocalypse is happening. You don't have to imagine it. It's there, and so it suggests Ukraine in a very different relation towards the future to come. It's a question of how do we address this now? I also quite interested, and I think Matilde and me talked about it one day, this kind of hype around gardening plots and vegetable plots, and people we have to be planting our vegetables. But obviously people in Ukraine and in many countries in Eastern Europe have been doing it all throughout the Soviet Union. It's just something that you do not because you're an environmentalist, but to survive. And in many ways, I'm super interested in plants, and I do a little bit of gardening here in the UK because I have this access to a patch of land, which in Ukraine also is not, if you live in a city, is quite a luxury to have in many ways. But when I talk to friends who grew up on the land in Ukraine, they hate gardening because that's what they had to do as children. A friend of mine is I wanted to play piano, but my grandma would go and make me you have to pull out the weeds, you have to do that to do that. For them, gardening is not this romantic environmentalist idea. So it's quite interesting the way I think they addressing this kind of overlaps, and something I heard also in Leyla saying that people saying we want the consumerist culture because we didn't have it. Is this idea, and is it? Yeah, I don't know. It's very complex. I don't really have any answers, but I think the overlaps to me, how it matches and mismatches is what's interesting, I guess, in my work. We have 5 minutes left. We have a question from Amy. I don't know if Amy would you like to? I don't know, Victoria, did we answer your question? Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Interesting.
I can really, really briefly ask my question. I actually have to go dead on because I have another meeting. But it was just prompted by something Leyla said about heritage and also what Matilde was saying. It made me think about the kind of former sites of extractive industries in Poland, in particular in Silesia. You have the kind of Guido mine becoming this museum of mines and mining, and the kind of heritageization of these former industrial sites, and whether it's kind of possible with the sites of the extractive industries, because they are it's not like turning an old house into a museum. You've got this kind of rendering in the environment that has to be encapsulated by it. And I'm wondering if you think, what are the kind of limits or possibilities of this kind of heritageization discourse, which has become a really kind of general way of sweeping difficult histories into the past, of saying actually it's heritage and we're going to talk about it as heritage. So I just wanted you maybe to reflect on that a little bit, but I know it's hardly any time.
It's a new utopia, is heritage.
We'll use the remaining 5 minutes to advertise our event in the Center of Energetics, which will be it's called The Place for Oil, and it's a workshop where we meet with oil museums and visit oil museums and discuss with especially with people working on academics working on industrial heritage about what is to become of oil. What is becoming of oil as heritage right now, and what will be in the future. So I invite you and anyone else interested in this topic to join us on 26th. It will start on 26th of April and will last till 30th of April. And we will advertise, I think, from today on. Yeah, but I mean, I think it's happening already in a lot of places, but at different pace again, because there are different societal state public relations and between oil industries and publics. And one part of my research is actually going to look at how oil industry is already looked as a tourist attraction in Baku, and as tourist industry is actually seen as one of the industries that can potentially help to diversify the economy a bit, if not completely divest from oil.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add, but I do think like this turn-in of like these sites into museums, I wonder if it also can be seen as like a solution of like this issue that Leyla was talking about, like what do you do with the infrastructure? Like do you kind of get rid of it, or like, and if you get rid of it, where does it go? Like do you throw it out into space? Or so I think like when people are like making these places into sites of heritage, it's a bit to kind of like maybe like just be like, okay, like now we're doing something with it, so it's not like industrial waste anymore, kind of. Yeah.
For me, I was quite interested. I've been to Zollverein, actually somehow happened twice in different years. Is the biggest, is the mine converted into, I think it's UNESCO heritage as well, of industrial heritage. But for me, it was interesting, and it's incredible to be there and to see it, and it's something that I found people in Ukraine really aspire to. Like we should be like that. Like we should be like Zollverein. Once again, that's kind of catching up rhetoric, and it's great. And obviously, as a person working with culture, I'm like, oh, this is really cool. But I asked the tour guide who's leading us. If there are any miners given tours, but the ex-miners were not actually keen to be involved. And for me, it's once again the question: how do you engage different actors? How do you engage people working in the industry that they don't feel then there's this commercialization, this is new kind of luxury culture in a way appearing that they don't belong to? And I think I don't really have any answers to that. And maybe that's also the roles of the humanities of kind of trying to see the multiple perspectives and integrate them in some kind of dialogue, which obviously wouldn't be able to suit everybody, but maybe can address some of the opinions.
Thank you very much. I've just got a little pop-up telling me my other meeting has started. So I have to leave on that moment, but this has been really fascinating, and thank you so much for your considered answers as well. It was a real joy. Okay, bye.
Thank you, Amy. Yes, I see Victoria's typing something. Don't know if, promoting another promotion this time of the article.
Mm-hmm.
I guess if there are no, we're out of time anyway, but if anybody has a present question, maybe we can answer that, or just to wrap up. It's not the most optimistic for the future talk to finish the series with, to be honest. I feel like everybody's like, oh. Yeah, thank you all for coming then and for asking questions. I think Victoria's typing another comment. And we'll be in touch. I think this is the end of the series of area access all areas, unfortunately, but I think there's another event planned. Hopefully, I think the CRSCEES will advertise at some point soon. Happy Day of the Cosmonaut, yeah. Thank you, Matilde. Thank you, Leyla. It was really fascinating talking to you, and we should continue